Welcome back to another episode of Offbeat Adventures. We're standing here once again on the grade of the former Canadian Northern Railway and later Canadian National Railways, Dorion and then subsequently Kinghorn Subdivision. We are just to the west of the community of Red Rock, Ontario. We're actually right at the western end of the siding at a place called Robford. You can actually see the end of the siding right here where it comes back into the grade. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be picking up from this hike here, this previous hike that we did from Red Rock to Robford, and we're going to be working our way to the west to another station called Everard. It's not a particularly long hike. There are a few things to see, but in many ways as well, it's also a fairly quiet hike. Not a ton of things to see, particularly in the middle part. I'll do my best to try to keep you entertained. One of the things that you'll notice here, we're at the beginning of May. Today is the 8th of May. And you will see these patches of snow all over the place. We had, I've been saying this on all our hikes the start of this year. We had a particularly bad winter with lots of snow. And we had maybe even a worse spring with lots of snow. We had about 5 weeks in a row starting towards the end of March where we got snow, and it wasn't particularly warm, and so the snow, we've only really had warm temperatures the last couple of weeks, and so the snow is going away quickly, but we're probably about 3 weeks behind where we should be in terms of the spring. The ballast in this section is a little bit thick at times. You just saw that, my near little wipeout. So it is a very beautiful May morning here. So this section is a redo. So we did this section back in the fall of 2020, and so we're redoing it because, as with all of our redos, there's some new information that's sort of come up since then, and so we want to make sure that everything that we show and mention is up to date. So as I mentioned, this is kind of a quiet section. There's a couple of things here at the beginning part, and then there's a few things, probably the biggest thing towards the end. Right when we reach our destination at Everard, we're going to be crossing a fairly large bridge over the Black Sturgeon River. So one of our features is coming up right here. You can see this area is pretty low and pretty flat. We passed a little curve there at the end of the siding at Robford. There's one major curve up ahead, and then there's another slight little curve as we get into Everard. That's it. Otherwise the grade is just straight and flat, and we see a big geography change. So this kind of area here where it's kind of a little bit higher and drier, that starts to change very shortly here, just as we pass this patch of snow. The snow has been kind of interesting. It's not easy to ride the bike on there because it's not all necessarily snow. There's ice in here, as you can see, and without any studded tires or a fat tire bike, you tend to slip and slide a lot, especially with the ballast that's underneath. So this is one of the few patches. There's a patch here and there's one a little bit further up. So this is our first kind of little big feature, and it's a rock cut. Again, it's fairly unusual to see one in this area, simply because it's pretty flat. There's not really any significant rock cuts for the next little while. It's not particularly high. I want to say maybe in the 8-foot range, maybe 9-foot range. Over here we have a little remnant. So there is a tie plate sticking in there. Again, this section is very quiet. There's not a lot to see. And so here we start getting into swampy sections. And this is a fairly large swamp. There's a pretty high embankment over this swamp. You can imagine the construction work that was needed to go through this swamp. Now another thing, again, this middle section is pretty quiet, and really there's not a lot to see, not even culverts. And so this is actually one of our few culverts that we pass over. There is a marker on it, but the marker is completely illegible. The only real thing to see here is you can actually see the remnants of the previous concrete culvert that was in here, one of the segmented concrete culverts that they put in. And so you can see some remains of it here on the south side of the grade, and then you can see some remains here on the north side. And so you can see a couple of the pieces here, and then the culvert itself is right in this spot. There's quite a bit of water. When I was here in 2020, obviously in the fall, a lot of these spots were all dry. Again, with all the snow that we've had, all the precipitation that we've had this winter and this spring, the water levels are very, very high. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna hop up on the bike and just continue plodding our way to the west. All right, so back in the saddle here. Kind of interesting thing, I'm sort of thinking back to that 2020 hike, and one of the more interesting things that happened to me is when I was actually taking a look at those concrete culvert segments. I actually dinged myself up pretty good, and I remember, I'll show a picture if I can find one. Had a pretty big scrape on my leg, and blood was all running down my leg, and so what do? You pull up your sock, and away you go. Remember, that was it was a pretty big scrape. It took a while for it to heal. All right, so again, we're just sort of plodding along on this this embankment. Lots of beaver work alongside the grade. There's going to be a series of dams and fairly flooded areas that you'll see alongside the grade. And so here's kind of up here is kind of the last little vestiges of kind of the sort of more upland terrain. And as we get a little bit further to the west, we start getting into kind of more swampier type of country, a little bit more sort of indicative of this area, what I call the shield country. The ballast here is pretty thick. There's a piece of a tie down there. I do have a new bike. Yesterday was my maiden ride with the new bike here, so I'm just trying to get used to it. It's a bit of an upgrade from my old bike. It was only 2 years old. I bought a new bike basically because my younger son needed a bike, and he doesn't really ride very much. Most of the time, the only time he ever rides a bike is when I drag him out on the occasional hike with me. And so I thought it was just better if I just get myself a upgraded one and give Noah my old one. It's fairly similar. It's the same model group as my previous bike, just a little bit more expensive. And I got rid of the old bike had a front derailleur, and the upgraded version doesn't have a front derailleur, which is nice because sometimes the derailleur that switch would get snagged on my gear, and sometimes I would inadvertently switch the gear. I'd go to pedal and the chain would fall off. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to zip you ahead a little bit up till we get to that curve, and then we'll go from there. Here you can see one of these flooded areas here. You can see that. And I don't think it was like this when I was here in 2020. Again, water levels are high because of the spring runoff. But you can see that the water is probably less than a foot from the top of the grade. All right, so we're going to hold up here just by this tree alongside the grade. You can see we've already started to switch in terms of the geography, and I'll talk about that in the next segment. So around here is supposed to be milepost 136. There's no traces of it. I looked. So milepost 136 is the mileage on the Kinghorn line, and for the original lines, what we have to do, so the Canadian Northern Railway Nipigon Subdivision and the Canadian National Railway Dorion Subdivision, we have to subtract 49.7 because those lines started in Jellicoe, not Long Lac, and so the mileage is different, and so the mileage on those lines would be 86.3. Okay, so we're going to stop up here, and then we're going to resume our westward journey.